introduce our second speaker, Ken Smith. Off the top of my head, our second speaker, Ken Smith, will dazzle us with a 5 to 7 minute impromptu speech on a subject given to us by his evaluator from among 5 topics that Ken has at least some working knowledge. Please help me welcome Ken Smith, off the top of my head, Ken Smith.
Mr. Evaluator, what is my topic?
Income taxes.
Oh my
Thank you very much.
God.
Mr. Evaluator, fellow Toastmasters, Madam Toastmaster, and our most welcome guest. Income taxes. You know, before 1913, the federal government did just fine. America grew. It was a very prosperous nation, and we did not have an income tax. We had taxes on we had tariffs for imported goods. We had taxes on liquor and other items. And it was enough, other than during war, where money had to be borrowed, to cover the federal expenses. And we did just fine. 1913 was, to me, a devastating year. It was 100 years ago this year. We had 3 major events that happened that year. The income tax law was, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was passed. The 17th Amendment, which was the popular election of the Senate, and the Federal Reserve was created. That's not an amendment, that's just simply a law passed by legislature. But the 3 worked together, and they combined set us on a horrible course, I believe, for this country. The founders and everyone since then was well aware of the problems of having a central bank. This has been the experience of other nations. The Bank of England, for example, wanted to keep England in as many wars as possible because the government had to borrow money from the bank, and what does the bank make its money on? Loaning money, earning interest. That's what our Federal Reserve does today. But how is it structured? Well, it worked best by first passing the Income Tax Act. Now, most of you think that your salaries are income. They're not. And they were not included in that act. This is an insidious thing that our culture or the government has done, is slowly indoctrinate us that our wages are income. The people who passed that act were trying to do a get-rich-quick scheme off the wealthy. Income, then, is what we refer to as capital gains or profits today. So the people who just work for a living weren't going to be affected. And in fact, the initial rate was 1% for up to $50,000 a year of income, 2% for up to 100, 3% up to 150, capping it at 7% for $350,000 a year of income. Income, again, not being wages, but profits or capital gains. We have changed the language, and so what we all think today is what we earn is income and we're subject to tax, but that's really not the case. A law means what the authors of the law intended for it to mean. So this is being challenged in the Supreme Court. It won't go anywhere because there's too much invested now in this huge thing we call federal government. But one of the ways they got around that was at the same time they passed the popular election of the Senate. See, we had checks and balances in our federal government. You all know that we have 3 co-equal branches of government. Well, not co-equal anymore because the Supreme Court says, no, we're the superior branch. But then the federal government was balanced against the states because the Senate was made up of people sent there by the legislatures of the states. So the state itself was being represented in the Senate not just the mass peoples of the United States. So that was another equal part, but the worst part was the Federal Reserve. And this is what has allowed all of this to happen. We didn't want, most of the people in the United States did not want a central bank. So they had to fool us. In 1910, 5 major bankers met together on Jekyll Island off the coast of North Carolina in secret. They actually wore disguises and traveled there separately so that no one would put it together. And they came up with this monster that we now call the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is not a governmental agency. It's a privately owned bank, owned by the 5 major banks. And their job is to make as much money as they can for them, the stockholders. And so they want to keep us in debt. So that's why we have this huge federal deficit, $17 billion, upon which we pay, I think it's $17 trillion, on which we pay about $350 billion a year to this private corporation called the Federal Reserve. And the way they can collect it is, if you're an employee, you have no clue. If you're an employer, you write the checks to the Internal Revenue Service. So you can look at the back of the check and see how it's endorsed. And it is endorsed for deposit to the account of, no, not the US Treasury, the Federal Reserve. All of our taxes go to the Federal Reserve, and they take their skim off the top, basically, the interest, and put into the account for the federal government how much is theirs. So they have this ongoing flow of money that's guaranteed. They don't have to worry about the government defaulting because the government doesn't get the money, except from the Federal Reserve. They don't get our money. Our money goes through income tax, what's now called, or wages are now called income taxes, and it goes from that straight into the Federal Reserve. They take their profits, and they're never audited because it's a private corporation. So that's where we are today. So there is no bandage that's going to take care of this. The easiest one to get rid of is the Federal Reserve, because that just takes a legislative order. If we can get both branches of the legislature and president to sign it. But then we have a big problem to deal with. We're all carrying useless paper. So there will have to be a transition from one to the other. The other two require amendments to the amendments to repeal them. So think about that. This has to be done. Our children are born in bondage, financial bondage. Madam Toastmaster.
Right.